It is Super Bowl Sunday. It is also Communion Sunday. And as we continue in this series talking about what it means to have prophetic imagination and to employ this at a time in our society and in many of our families where it feels like we are so divided, how do we use that gift of God, that prophetic imagination, to be bridge builders? And so I thought it would be good for us for our scripture this morning, to just remind ourselves and reread the passage from First Corinthians 11. This is a passage that we typically use on a communion morning to introduce this sacrament, this tradition of Eucharist. That word means Thanksgiving. And this is the story that comes from this church in Corinth, where Paul in the first century is writing a letter to this home church, and he's doing so. One of the reasons he's doing so is because he's hearing things that kind of disturb him. That when they are coming together for communion, which in those days they did on a very regular basis, if not daily, then definitely weekly, they'd come together to share a meal, right? And it was Jew and Gentile, it was slave and free, it was male and female. Everyone was to come together. And Paul writes a letter to this church, this group that's meeting in homes in Corinth, and says, I hear that when you're gathering, your servants are having to eat in a different room, and that you're divided, and the wealthy and the poor, and some people are eating more and less. And he said, you're missing the whole point. The reason that Christ had us do this, to remember God in this way, was so that we would come together, so that the divisions that we have would be minimized, and the unity that we have in Christ could be maximized. And so the connection that we have with each other would be the way that we experience God's love and wholeness. And so Paul says, come together, leave those things beside, come together. And then he says, what I received from the Lord, I pass on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. And he said, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So come together, bridge your divides, be unified in this prophetic act, give thanks, practice gratitude, and then remember how loved you are. Remember that you are forgiven. Remember that you are together, my body, and the way you love one another is how the world will know of my healing love. So this conversation we've been having about being prophetic imaginers, and how thinking outside of the limits of what is and how we have experienced life into what can be, and how it is that God is calling us into a more beloved community, an imagined future. It's been a great conversation. Last week we talked with and learned from Phil Miller, who is a professional mediator, in some of the challenges that he's had to work through. And then we also spoke with and learned from Sam Kevern, who is herself an engineer and literally builds bridges, and the metaphors and the lessons that those two bridge builders were able to teach us so that we could be better bridge builders as we employ our prophetic imagination was wonderful. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that or watch that sermon, I would encourage you to do so. This morning, I'm equally excited and been so thankful to have these conversations, these interviews with these very talented and big-hearted, wise people, these two other bridge builders that you're going to hear from this morning. But before I share with you their wisdom and stories, I want to make sure that we understand a couple of things as we think about this process of bridge building and what it means to be a bridge builder. First is that the bridge building is a lot of work. It is. And it's not easy work. And that work starts right here. That work starts with me. That work starts with you. That work starts with our hearts and our souls. If we want to be productive, if we want to be effective bridge builders, we need to make sure that we ourselves have a firm foundation, that we are established in the knowledge and in the certainty that we are beloved children of God, that we are beautiful and created in God's image, and also that we are fallible, and we are thankful for the grace of God that is extended to us so that we can extend that to others. Bridge building can be dangerous work, and we need to go into it knowing that we have counted the cost and considered what it's about and done the work. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, and what our first bridge builder will share with us this morning, is that building a bridge to someone else, right? Those individuals or group that might be on the other side of you, or someone you disagree with, maybe even feel like are enemies, at least of your understanding and your worldview. The idea of building a bridge, being reconcilers, does not mean that you just love them and you move on, that you forgive and forget. That's not the kind of bridge building we're talking about. Like God's love for the world, the kind of love that is necessary for this bridge building and reconciliation is a deep and eternal love, right? When we, as followers of Jesus Christ, talk about love, we're not just talking about a feeling. Hopefully there is a feeling that is attached to it, but as Bishop Michael Curry says in the Episcopal Church, he says the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is self-centeredness. If we think the opposite of love is hate, then we're just kind of stuck in that emotion, that feeling. But the opposite of love is self-centeredness, because love is a verb. Love is outward looking. Dr. King said that love in public is justice. So loving our enemies, building bridges is not forgetting. It's not just having good feelings towards them. It is moving forward through a process of repentance and forgiveness, of reconciliation and healing. That's what God has done for us in Christ, and filled with God's love and grace and forgiveness, we are called to be extenders of that grace and builders of justice and reconciliation. One of my professors in seminary, Miroslav Volf, wrote in his book, Exclusion and Embrace, he said, forgiveness is not a substitute for justice. Forgiveness without justice is cheap reconciliation. And that's not what we're looking for. Genuine and lasting reconciliation is possible only on the basis of both forgiveness and reparation of wrongs. To put it another way, if we're going to build a sturdy bridge and secure lasting reconciliation, two keystones are essential, and those are forgiveness and justice. Jalilah Otto was generous enough this past week to take some time to share with me the stories and the lessons that she learned from her family growing up as a young girl in Kansas City, and also from her extended family, from her husband's family, and then, of course, from the years that she has spent both as a prosecutor, but then most recently for a number of years as a very widely respected judge in Jackson County. And so here is part of my conversation with this bridge builder, Judge Jalilah Otto. Probably be helpful just to start off with explaining who you are and what you do, and why my wife thought you'd be the best person to talk to for this series.
Well, thanks for having me. As you said, my name is Jalilah Otto. I currently serve as the administrative judge of the family court here in Jackson County. I'm a circuit judge. I deal with all issues involving children, abuse and neglect cases, adoption cases, anything that kind of touches upon the family, and especially with those kids under the age of 18.
Well, you know, we're struggling with a time in our society where people feel more divided than ever, and you don't need to go into specifics, but just some examples of brokenness and division, and how you've maybe seen opportunities for justice and reconciliation.
So as a judge, and any lawyer can tell you this, every case comes before me because there's a level of division. It's John Doe versus Tom Smith. That versus in the middle is that division. I'll just use maybe like a domestic case, like a divorce case, right? That comes in front of me. There's a lot of division. And quite frankly, oftentimes there's a lot of hurt and anger and history there that colors people's positions on any issue. If people have been married for 20 years, and the amount of time you're actually going to get to hear their case, which may last, let's just say, a day or two, it's difficult to consolidate all of that down into that finite amount of time. And so what people end up doing is they begin to focus on the most egregious parts of those divisions.
Interesting.
And one of the very first things that I always recommend is mediation. I order mediation, just because sometimes when you're able to get people into a room with a qualified mediator and say, while I recognize there were these egregious behaviors that you're focused on, if we can kind of move all of that aside and focus on what the actual core issue is, which is how do we move forward from this point, you can get things done. I just think that people get arrested in those moments, and it's hard for them to move past that. And so,
well, that's interesting. So, for example, you've been a prosecutor on the bench long enough. Have you seen where you saw this horrible division and then did the best to kind of apply justice, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you're like, look at that. That's there is hope.
I actually have a great story for this. I was at a restaurant and I was ordering takeout, and I gave the man behind the counter my card to run, and he looked at it. He said, "Otto, Jalilah Otto, are you Judge Otto?" And in that moment, just because I've done criminal cases for so long, I'm always like,
right.
Do I say yes? Do I say no? And I'm like, I said, yes, I am Judge Otto. He said, I thought that was you. He said, you don't remember this, but I was in your courtroom in 2015. He said, I was 17 years old and I'd been charged with some felony offense. He said, and I was looking at 7 years in prison. So I asked the prosecutor, had you looked into any kind of prosecution deferment, because he was young, he was in school. Could this be someone who benefits from job training? Could he benefit from giving some kind of restitution? They ended up letting him into that deferred prosecution program. And he told me when I'm in the register line or in the line to buy my food, that moment changed his life. And he said, I was 17 then, I'm 21, 22 now. He said, I got my degree. He said, I got a job. He's like, you changed my life in that moment, because I thought all I had was 7 years of prison in front of me. But in fact, you showed me that there was possibly more that I could be doing and more that I could be contributing to society. He said, so I just want to say thanks. And I was like, oh, wow. I didn't expect to get that when I got my carry out, but I'll take it.
Are there practical things that could maybe translate to folks in our congregation as to, as they engage in life and the challenges and the divides that we face?
My father taught me how to love education, that he knew education was a great equalizer. And my mother taught me to love the Lord. And she knew that was going to be the great elevator. And so whenever I get into these places, if I can focus on learning something and thinking about, how much the Lord loves me and I love him, that moves me. I would encourage people to be creative, think outside the box, be open-minded, recognize that you don't have all of the answers.
Yeah.
Use the team around you, have conversations with people who don't look like you, who maybe grew up very different than you. They're going to bring a perspective that you never would have even considered. Final
question. Was there any conflict that you dealt with that the parties were convinced that this is not going to work? This is a done deal. This is over. And somehow they were surprised? I
remember a specific case, and they were definitely in their respective corners, just ready to slug it out. And in the middle of the ring were two kids. It was their two kids. Yeah. Who's going to be the casualty, here? While you may think that you're winning in that moment by isolating a child, who's losing?
Right.
So as I said, I was raised in, the city of Kansas City. My husband was raised in Kansas City, Kansas. And he is biracial. His mother is white. His father is Black. And his mother is actually from Shelby County, Missouri. Okay. And they're farmers. And in fact, when she was born, my mother-in-law, her parents were Amish. And so I remember when the very first time I went up there and I was like, I don't know what this is going to be like. And I walked in there and I couldn't begin to tell you the amount of love that they poured out toward me. And I look different. I came from a very different background. Their perspectives are not always what I was used to hearing. We had some very difficult and challenging and interesting conversations over the Thanksgiving dinner table about, and it begins to kind of, frame your perspective and make you a little more, look at things a little more three-dimensionally than what you would see on the nightly news or what you would get in a tweet. I would encourage people to find those outlets. I married into mine, and that's great. But maybe you will worship into yours. Maybe your children's school will lead you into that, and you're going to have conversations, and it's going to be uncomfortable in moments. But it's those uncomfortable conversations where I think true growth can happen for all parties, and that's where we have to stop talking at each other, and you have to start talking with each other.
That was very, very helpful, Judge Otto. Jalilah, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, well, thank you. Tell George Wolf I said hello. I haven't seen him in ages either. And give Stacy a big hug. Be kind to her.
Yeah, okay. Will do. Yeah, hopefully cross paths again soon. She's fantastic, and I think actually Judge Otto was going to try to join us this morning, so I don't know if she's on the Zoom call or with us. Thank you, Jalilah, for giving us that time and your insights. As I have had the pleasure to listen to these wise and experienced bridge builders the last few weeks, I personally became more aware of my need and my responsibility to do my own work as a pastor, as a reconciler, as someone who wants to be, the change that I want to see in the world. A bridge builder. One of the I remember one of the professors in one of my classes, my graduate classes I took, was a psychology class, and some people were like, why do we have to take this class? And the point that they made was that if you want to be a reconciler, if you want to be a peacemaker, if you want to be someone who's a bridge builder, you need to take some time to do your own work. The reason we require you to go through therapy, and we had to sit through a number of hours of therapy. The reason you have to study family systems and all of these things is because you need to be aware of your own wounds. You need to be aware of your own scars and the trauma that you've been through, because if you're not aware of that, even though you intend to be a bridge builder, even though you intend to be a reconciler, you will end up bleeding your own wounds upon those that you're trying to help. And so just being aware of who we are and doing that work, understanding where our scars are, will help us to be better bridge builders, help us to be better reconcilers and builders of community. Sally King, who some of you will recognize, she has been a friend of Second's for quite some time. Her kids went through our ECLC program. She teaches yoga at Second. She's also has got her master's in social work and is credentialed at the highest level. She's a therapist, and a very good one. And I had the opportunity to speak with her on Friday and was really blessed by her wisdom as a therapist, as a bridge builder. And so here's a listen to part of our conversation. Maybe just take a minute and introduce yourself. Maybe even tell our congregation where you're sitting this morning.
Yeah. Well, I am in the gallery room at Second Presbyterian Church. My love for Second Presbyterian started almost 5 or 6 years ago with my youngest daughter in ECLC, the preschool here. My day job is a clinical social worker. So that's what my career has been for almost 20, 25 years. In the last kind of 10 years, I've gone into private practice. So I do mostly adult and older adult mental health therapy. Before COVID, that was driving around and visiting folks in their homes. That is a Medicare benefit a lot of people don't know.
When you think about this desire we have as people to be peacemakers or bridge builders, where does that work start?
Well, I have found, especially with COVID and sort of the political situation, that things, I have a lot of clients that I see on Zoom right now, and they are struggling with a myriad of things, but situational depression is one of them, caused by this little T, I call it, little trauma of COVID and the isolation around all that. And so it's hard when we're depressed, our right hemisphere is kind of shut down. And kind of step one, some of even the premature steps that we really work on is, how do we build capacity in people? Because when we have capacity in our soul and our spirit, then we can connect, then we can be vulnerable.
Okay. How do people, understand when you say trauma, because some people might, it's like, yeah, I've been home for 10 months and whatever, but I don't know if it feels like trauma.
We've all had wounding in our life, right? We've been hurt by people, and sometimes that wounding is little t, like stressors at work, kid goes off to college, empty nest, bankruptcy, financial problems, COVID, right? And most of us are resilient enough with given good social support to come out of that naturally without the need for pharmaceuticals or even a therapist. Then there's folks that have big T trauma, right? And that can sometimes lead to PTSD, and that's bigger issues. And I don't want to go into that, but the number one thing that helps people get through little T trauma and big T trauma is connection, ironically. I mean, this is when veterans come home and have raging PTSD, we put them immediately in group therapy.
Yeah.
And they go, I don't want to do that. And let me tell you, having been a group therapist for 10 years, you get them connecting and it's like magic happens. And the trauma symptomology starts going away. So you can't have connection until you have capacity. And capacity is generally built by joy, by relationships that bring joy, because that connection of even just being in presence with people is so important. Even if you don't politically agree, even connection is what is therapeutically what our bodies need.
I mean, there's some of us walking around, and I'll admit to this. I think in the last 10 months, my right hemisphere is kind of shrunk or whatever.
Totally.
And the ability to deal with stuff is my capacity is less. So how do you begin to build that up?
Yeah. Well, what the neuroscience says builds capacity from a real practical standpoint. Remember, most of our wounding is from people.
Yeah.
Right. So that's when I've got people in therapy, it's often from, so when we shut down, we don't want to connect. So how do we build that up? Well, there's two ways that the neuroscience says works pretty well. First one is gratitude. So, and remember, our brains are don't get killed machines. They have a preference for negative information because it keeps us safe. Brains don't really need to remember all the awesome stuff that happened to you. And so we tend to have this skewed idea of who we are because of this negative bias of our memory.
So our brains are wired to think worst case scenario, just to keep us alive.
Yes. So we have to kind of usurp that. We have to negate that by a lot of gratitude work, gratitude journaling, forcing your children to say something they're thankful for around the dinner table. And we do that with mixed results. And then the second neuroscience kind of way is remembering, and this is what we do with people with PTSD who are really shut. We'll all go around the circle in group therapy. Remember a Thanksgiving that was really awesome, or a childhood memory you have of with your family and people. And when we go there, it's like our brain goes, oh, maybe I can connect. Maybe people are safe. Those are two neuroscience ways. I have all sorts of other ideas.
Can you share with us an example of maybe a client or a situation you've worked with as a social worker where it just looked hopeless, like there was such a deep division, such anger, animosity, or brokenness that this was never going to get healed?
I've actually got a client, she's my age, that I'm working with, who's had a real long history of depression, and she's felt really disconnected from her mother. And one of the things that, and they've had a lot of political dissent between them, and it's been a real hard season the last couple of years. And so she just began to invite her mother to go on walks with her, and they didn't talk about anything political, masked and socially distanced. And the goal was just to bring up old memories, right? So we were working on that piece, and to just have presence with each other, right? And the more that the presence happened and they didn't talk about the hard stuff, then the connection was kind of reborn for them.
What are some practical things we could maybe try to do every day or once a week to begin to build up that capacity?
I think working on yourself, and working on your own vulnerability is a real action step.
Yeah.
Connection happens when you're willing to say, hey, I'm fallible.
Yeah.
So I think pushing yourself maybe to, as I like to say to my clients, run towards the roar. So that maybe the person that you're most afraid to connect with.
Run towards the roar.
Run towards the roar. We need to move towards people that maybe we don't necessarily aren't in our tribe.
if someone at Second is listening to this and going, I could really use some help, what are there some resources we can throw out to folks who they could connect with professionals that might be able to help them?
Please reach out to me if anyone wants to connect with mental health resources. It doesn't have to be with me. I'm very connected in the community with nonprofits and all ages resources, therapists for kids, adults, that sort of thing. SallyKeenConsulting@gmail.com.
Okay, we'll put that in the chat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. Really appreciate it, Sally.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thank you,
Yep.
Second Pres.
Well, I love the things that both of these women mentioned, and that Sally kind of highlighted 3 things that are essential for all of us to build up our capacity as followers of Christ, as peacemakers, right, and bridge builders, and that's to counteract, as she said, the negative thinking of our brains. And one of the challenges of COVID is that we've probably spent a lot more time alone, and filled with a lot of horrible news and really upsetting things that are happening in our world and in our country. And so our don't get killed brains, right, that tend to focus on what is negative and the worst case scenarios, the ways that we work against that and weave eternal wisdom and love into our souls so that we can be better bridge builders, right, is to practice gratitude, to reach out and actively connect with others regularly, and recall the goodness, right? Recall the goodness that we have received in our lives. These things, right? I don't think it's by coincidence that these are the very things that Jesus asked us to put into our regular practice together as his followers, right? Before he left them, right? He got together with them and he said, this is what you're going to do. You're going to break bread. You're going to gather together. You're not going to be divided. It's not going to be servants over there or women over there. You're going to come together. You're going to break bread. You're going to give thanks. And you're going to remember the good things. Remember how much you are loved. Remember that you are forgiven, and speak those words of goodness to each other as you share in that reconciliation and that healing together, so that you can go be healers, reconcilers, and bridge builders in the world. And so that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to share some remembering and some bread breaking and some gratitude together through the sacrament of communion.